Hey friends, I'm back with a new lesson. Well, a lot of people must have told you you ought to learn vocabulary, you ought to speak English, you ought to listen to English news. Alright, so what does ought to mean? Well, that is what today's lesson is all about, using ought to. Now, ought to is a modal verb. It is similar to should, okay, but it is a little stronger than should and not as strong as must. So let's say it's something like this. Okay, so it is stronger than should but not as strong as must. Okay, now a lot of people don't use it, and well, a lot of people get confused and they don't know how to use it. So in today's class we're going to learn how to use ought to. Being a modal verb, it has various meanings depending on how it is used in a sentence. Okay, so we're going to take some examples and see what are the different ways ought to is used. The first one, you ought to exercise more. Now one thing, remember, when you use ought to, the verb that follows always should be in the base form or the present form. So if I tell you, you ought to exercise more, what does this mean? Okay, I am making a recommendation or I'm advising you. Now probably you've been exercising a lot, okay, even maybe dieting, but no results. So I tell you, you ought to exercise more. That means I am recommending or I am suggesting or advising you to exercise more. So you can use ought to when you want to make a recommendation or give an advice. Okay. The next one, she ought to receive the package tonight. Okay. Now when I say she ought to receive the package tonight, that means there are great chances or there is a probability of her receiving the package tonight. So when you want to say something is a probability, you can go ahead and use ought to. Okay. So remember, when you want to say something, there is a probability of something happening or there are greater chances, go ahead and use ought to. So she ought to receive the package tonight. Okay. My third sentence, James ought to get the promotion. So you have ought to, the verb in the present form, ought to get the promotion. Now here it shows there is an expectation. It is expected that John is going to get a promotion because he deserves it. So when there is an expectation or when something is expected, you can say James ought to, or you can use the word ought to. Okay. Now these three sentences we've used in the present or something that could refer in the future. But how do we use ought to in the past? You use it with a past participle verb like this. I ought to have studied medicine, not pharmacy. Now it's ought to have and studied, the verb in the past participle form. Okay. Now why do I put this in the past participle, or what does it mean in the past? I ought to have studied medicine, not pharmacy. That means I have studied pharmacy, not medicine. So it's kind of regret or something that, you know, should have been ideal in the past, but it didn't happen. Okay. So there is a sense of regret, something that should have happened in the past, the correct thing or the ideal thing to happen in the past, but it didn't happen. That means I have studied pharmacy and now there is a sense of regret and I say I ought to have studied medicine, not pharmacy. Okay. My next example, you ought to have helped him. So when I say you ought to have helped him, the verb in the past participle, okay, something that you should have done, you didn't do. It was your duty to help him, but you did not help him. So, well, you ought to have helped him. That means there was a duty that you did not fulfill in the past. Okay friends, so this is how you use ought to in the past. Remember, it's ought to have with the verb in the past participle. So ought to have done, ought to have gone, ought to have finished. Okay, so I hope this much is clear to you. Now we'll take a look at using ought to in questions and negative. Okay, so now we have ought she call the police. Now this is not a very common way of using ought in a question. People generally prefer using should. So well, here you can say should she call the police, okay, or you say ought she call the police. Notice the to with ought to doesn't come in a question. So ought she call the police, like I said, it is not very commonly used in questions, but if you do, well, you're correct and use it correctly. Should she call the police, ought she call the police. Okay, the next example, ought we complete this now. So should we complete it now? You can replace it. No to. Okay. So ought we complete this now? So this is how you use ought in questions. Let's take a look at some negatives. You ought not smoke so much. Well, it's very bad. You should not smoke so much. So you ought not. Do not say ought to not. Okay, this is completely wrong. You do not use this to. You just say you ought not smoke so much. Okay, and the next negative, they ought not carry so much cash while traveling. They should not carry so much cash, but please do not say ought to not. All you say is ought not carry so much cash while traveling. So remember, in negatives and questions, you do not use to, you just use ought or ought not in negatives. Okay friends, well, this brings me to the end of another lesson. You ought to put down your comments and queries if any. I'll be back soon with a new lesson. Till then, take care and bye.